Hello, we are now working on joints, articulations. What is a joint? It's an articulation. What is an articulation? It's a place where two bones come together, right? So we're going to talk about those. All right. And one of the concepts, one of the first concepts to think about is not all joints are equal. What I mean by that is some of them are stable, they're strong, and some of them are unstable and not strong. And as we go through this and you learn about specific types of joints, think about that balance that there is between stability, how stable am I, how strong am I, and the ability to move, the range, we call it the range of motion, the ability to move it. So think about your hip joint. Think about your knee joint, think about shoulder joints. And then you'll do things like compare that joint between that and your tibial fibular joint. There's a joint between your tibia and your fibula, right? And that joint is very strong because it doesn't move much. So something to think about. Okay, so where bones meet together, and sometimes the joints may self-lubricate. But anyway, we digress. Joints. So again, we're going to be moving between, let's look at this nice and big. So we're going to be moving between the balance, the strength of a joint, and the range of motion. And the first way we're going to look at joints is we're going to look at what are they made of. So we're going to look at structural. So it says there's two methods for classifying. One is structural. We're going to look at that first. And then the next one is functional, like how does it work? So the first one is structural. So what is it made of? And we're going to see that there are fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial joints in terms of structure. Okay, so and remember, it's any two bones coming together. So the first thing we're going to talk about are fibrous joints. And the fibrous joints, what are they made of? Fiber. They're made of connective tissue. They don't move. So one example of fibrous joints are called synarthrosis. They don't move. And let's see. And sutures are fibrous joints. What is a suture? A suture is connective tissue. It's a fibrous joint. And you can see the bones of the skull are sutures. They're fibrous joints. They're not movable. How strong is that? How strong is that joint? Very strong. Okay, so little to no movement. They do not have a synovial cavity. We'll talk about that in a sec. Another type of fibrous joint are, I'm seeing if this is on our list. Yes, Gomphoses. I like that it says Gomphoses because it reminds me of where your teeth sit in the gums. So the joint of your tooth to the maxilla or mandible is a fibrous joint. It's fibrous. Teeth are not actually bones, but anyway, there we go. So these are examples of the different types of fibrous joints. And I think the last one we need to know is syndesmosis. Yeah, syndesmoses are slightly more movable, but they really don't move that much. And so a great example is your tibiofibular joint. Okay, so it's a bunch of cartilage, bunch of connective tissue between these two. So fibrous joints. Okay, now we're going on to joints that are made of cartilage. So cartilaginous joints, not very exciting, but we still have to know it. So cartilaginous joints are joints that are cartilage, not synovial, but cartilage joints. And the cartilage joint, don't worry about don't worry about the word amphiarthrosis right now, but cartilaginous, because there's a lot of terms. So lots of different types of cartilaginous joints. Symphysis and synchondrosis are the two types. So a symphysis is where it's fibrocartilage. So between the invertebral discs is one place, and the pubic symphysis, that's up here, that holds the front pubic bones together. So it's slightly movable. They're slightly movable, and then the discs are back here. So that's one type of cartilaginous joint. They're made of cartilage. They're made of fibrocartilage. And Synchondrosis, they're not that common, but they're the epiphyseal plates are made out of synchondrosis. So you might be saying to yourself, this is all like memorizing, right? I don't want you to memorize this. So as we go through this, just keep in mind that I'm going to have you probably compare things, like compare different types of joints on how stable they are, different types of joints for like what they're made of. That's how I'll ask you. So I don't want you to memorize this. I just want you to understand it. Does it make sense? You're not going to memorize that, oh, I have to know that syndesmosis is within the fibrous, because it's written down. So you don't need to memorize it. It's on here for you. You want to understand, oh, why is the syndesmosis? Why does it sit inside the fibrous joint? Okay, why is it part of one of those? Okay. Synovial is the next group. Synovial joints are more complicated, and don't worry about diarthrosis yet. Don't worry about this word diarthrosis. We'll get to there. But they are freely moving. They move. They're weak. They're most familiar. They're the ones that we think about. They're most subject to things like arthritis and dislocation. Okay. So we're going to see that they, how they work, what they're made of. So the first thing we're going to do is look at, okay, synovial joints. And I'm on page 2 now. And you want to know these parts of the synovial joint for lab. And then for lecture, you want to know how they work. So we have several slides showing different parts of a synovial joint. This synovial joint is between, it looks like it's one of the phalanges. It's the joints within a phalange, okay? So that's fine. So here's the joint. And you can see there's fluid inside here. I'm outlining where there'd be fluid. That's synovial fluid. There's a fibrous capsule. That capsule is made out of connective tissue. The synovial membrane is usually made out of, it's very thin. I don't think we have to know what it's made of, do we? Let's see. Yeah, we do. Areolar. Okay. It's very thin. The ends of these bones have hyaline cartilage or articular cartilage on them, so that makes it nice and smooth in here. So when those joints move past each other, sorry, when those bones move past each other, it doesn't rub or click or cause pain. There's sometimes ligaments to hold bone to bone. So sometimes a ligament is within that joint, going from one bone to the next bone. What else? Good. This is the joint cavity in here where the fluid is. All right. Good, good. Keep going with the anatomy. So that's what we're trying to look at. So there's another type of synovial joint. This one happens to be your knee joint. So we have articular cartilages. Don't forget those line. We have ligaments that run from bone to bone. So this is your PCL and ACL. We'll do that in lab. Don't worry about the names yet. There's another ligament. So those ligaments are all helping to stabilize, right? So what's the job of a ligament? It's going to hold two bones together. Sometimes you'll have, not very many, but you have this thing called a meniscus in your knee joint, that they are little pads of fibrocartilage. Let's see, what else? We did articular cartilage. Good, 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 good. Okay, let's keep going. We have tendons and ligaments. So tendons connect muscle to bone. Okay, I think that's it. That's all we need from that one. Okay, here's another one. I actually like this picture because it has more on it. So this is a good picture, I think. Okay, so what do we have on here? We can see the meniscus, right? So that we've got the articular cartilage. So all the things that we know about already, articular cartilage on both sides of the bones. We have the whole joint cavity and the synovial fluid inside of it. Okay. There's sometimes fat pads. There's also sometimes little bursas. So a bursa is just a little sac of, like a little sac with synovial fluid in it. And what it does is it keeps the friction down. So you have bursa in your, you might have heard of bursitis before in somebody's elbow. People tend to get, like, if somebody says, oh, I have tennis elbow, it's actually bursitis. So this thing gets inflamed because of too much moving around, okay? So bursa are in really, really, really moving the joints that we have that move a lot, like your elbow and your knee have bursa. Anything else? Okay. So another thing about, sometimes we have these things called tendon sheaths. I don't think that's on our list, but we have something called tendon sheaths where it wraps a whole bunch. If you have a whole bunch of tendons, like carpal tunnel, what happens is these tendons get inflamed, but they're sitting in the sheath, in this sheath that's right here, and they start rubbing, and then you have pain. Yeah. But I don't think that's on our list. It's interesting though. Okay, range of motion. So don't forget, range of motion is next. And we're doing good. So we did all that anatomy, and that'll be mostly in, you're not going to see any pictures in lecture, but you might compare like the function of bursa to ligaments, let's say. So there's you still need to know the anatomy in lecture. Okay. Range of motion, don't forget. I just want you to think about, like, if you move a lot, what are you giving up, right? And we're going to continue to think about that as we learn about synovial joints. So we're still talking about synovial joints. So there's several kinds of synovial joints, and we're on page 3. It says types of synovial joints, several kinds. There's planar, hinge, pivot, ellipsoidal, saddle, and ball and socket, okay? And as we go through these, it says to draw them on your lecture notes, but as we kind of go through these, what you want to also think about is just, is this, what kind of range of motion do I have, and what kind of stability does this joint have? Okay, so each one of these, you want to think about that. So planar joints are are bones that sort of move, they glide or they move past each other like this. So they're two bones that move like this. So it's very little motion. They don't go around in circles. They don't move this way. They're not doing something like that. They're just sliding this way. So your wrist bones, your carpals, or your tarsals are good examples of gliding joints. Okay, so it says intercarpal, intertarsal, very much so. They're very, very limiting on how much movement there will be. So the movements allowed are just basically gliding. What they're saying is it allows for a little bit of this movement, the gliding. So look down here, and we're looking at movements. Look down here, movements allowed. And there's a bunch of terms that you're going to need to know for lab for sure. So abduction, to be abducted by aliens, means that you're moving away from the midline. And so yes, the gliding, collectively, those gliding joints allow for a little bit of abduction, but I don't tend to think of that much. I would say they more just glide a little bit. But you do need to know what abduction is. And adduction means to move closer to the body. So I like to use the joint here. Whenever you're talking about joints, you want to specify what the joint is that you're discussing. So if I'm talking about the ball and socket joint of my, my shoulder, I need to say it's the humerus, the scapula, really it's just those two, and a little bit of clavicle. So that joint allows me to abduct. I just abducted, and it allows me to adduct and bring it back down. Everybody see that? So you want to know what that movement is. As far as, but that is a ball and socket joint. That is not a gliding joint where it's just allowing a little bit. So this one is very stable. All right, and I think that's good. We're leaving that there. So you want to know how much it can move, and what types of movement it allows, like abduction and adduction, a little bit, mostly gliding. Good. Okay, next one, hinge joints. Hinge joints. A classic hinge joint is your radial, classic hinge joint is true humerus. So it says elbow, and I really want us to clean up the word elbow because there are two joints there. So I would rather not use the word elbow. I would like you to say the humerus to ulna joint, humerus to ulna joint, okay? And the reason why is there's also a joint between your ulna and your radius. So there's two joints there in your elbow, and I don't want us to confuse. So this is not the joint that I'm looking at. I'm looking at the joint that does this. That's a hinge joint, okay? So your hinge joint, you saw the motion. The hinge joint, you saw that motion. And that motion is flexion, making the angle, decreasing the angle of the joint, or increasing it is extension. Flexion and extension. And it allows for more motion, more movement than a gliding joint. However, it's still pretty limited in one plane, that you're moving kind of in one plane rather than many planes. Okay, what else do we need to know about hinge joints? You don't have to use the word monoaxial, but I'd like you to have some examples. Interphalange, what does that mean? So these right here are hinge joints, interphalange. So the middle and the proximal are hinge joints, okay? So try to make your hinge joint, everybody take your hinge joint right here. You need to hold, we're trying to isolate joints. So you need to hold the palm of your hand. So try to make this move in a circle. You can't. That's a hinge joint. Hinge joints cannot move in a circle. You can't do much besides just flexion and extension, okay? One second here. I'm gonna pause the recording. Okay, so we're talking about, the next type is the pivot joint. Okay, that's the third down, the pivot joint. And you have a couple really good pivot joints. Moving your head back and forth is a pivot joint. The problem is that is a complex, the joint between C1 and your occipital bone of your skull is complicated because there's actually two joints working at the same time. So what I'm going to say is it's C1 to C2 only that I'm talking about that's pivoting back and forth. C1 to C2, it's pivoting on the dens back and forth. That allows for rotation. Another rotation pivoting joint is your radius to ulnar. So you do want to have an example. You can see I'm pivoting. That's a pivot joint that allows for rotation. Now, I want you to try to do something. I want you to, just so you can see kind of what I mean by rotation. Do the same thing again. Hold your phalange up, right? Second phalange. Hold it up, phalanx. Try to rotate this finger. You can't. Try to rotate it. You can't. You can do this, but you can't rotate it so that your nail would be moving in that direction. You can't do it. So rotation is a very specific movement that is allowed by the pivot joint, okay? And you want to have an example. Okay. Next one, ellipsoidal. Oh, whoops, condylar. Oh, okay, I guess we're not doing condylar joints. The reason why is there aren't that many. You only have a couple of these, so we're going to skip the condylar. All right. Oh, maybe they're calling condylar. Ah, they're calling condylar ellipsoidal. Okay, we are doing it. There aren't that many of them. So there's a couple ellipsoidal joints. Let me show you what it looks like. I actually think it really is hard to see this. What you've got is like a little cup, something that's shaped like this, and you have something that's sitting inside of it like this. It's not ball and socket. It only allows it to sort of move in this direction like this. So it does allow for circumduction, which means like that. And this joint right here, so it's the base, the metacarpals to the phalange. of your first, only the thumb. Hold on. Yep. Am I wrong? I'm wrong. Metacarpal phalange. Oh, it's not the thumb. It's metacarpal phalange. So metacarpal phalange 2 through 5. So it's 2, 3, 4, and 5. So metacarpal phalange. These are condylar. Okay. Do you see how I'm circumducting? I can't rotate, but I can circumduct. Circumduct means you can draw a circle with the end of that, whatever the end of that surface is. I was going to say lever. Okay. What else? Okay, we're starting to see more range of motion. Are you seeing that? That's going to give me more range of motion. That means it's less stable. So it's easy to jam these if you've ever had a jam of your condylar. All right. It's the saddle joint that I was thinking about. Okay, saddle joints. So saddle joints have a like a saddle that the joint sits in like this. It's like a saddle. And they're fairly stable. You don't have that many. Trapeziometacarpal is not one that we're going to be able to think about. Let's see if I have another example of a saddle joint. Yeah, it's the thumb. That's the one I was thinking about that we don't have that many of. So saddle joints, and you can see I don't memorize this stuff either. I look it up and understand it. That's what I'm looking for you. So this is an example of your saddle joint, is your thumb, so first phalange to first metacarpal. And what does it allow? Okay, so we're going to allow flexion. I'm trying to hold all the joints. Flexion and extension and abduction. So this way. I can go this way and I can go this way. Circumduction is allowed as well. These are these opposable thumbs. We can allow, it allows a lot of different movements. But the thing is, it's very, very, very rare, these saddle joints. So you probably won't see it too much because it's just so rare. Okay. Ball and socket. This is the last synovial joint. Ball and socket, very classic ball and socket would be your humerus. And we call it glenohumeral because it's the glenoid cavity that the humerus sits in. But you can also, I'm fine with you calling it humerus to scapula. I do not want you to call it shoulder joint. There's a lot of bones up there, and it could be many bones that you're talking about. So don't call it your pelvic joint. It's your femur to your pubic, okay? So try to name the bones when you're talking about joints, okay? So ball and socket allows for circumduction, allows for rotation, allows for flexion and extension, allows for abduction and adduction. So pretty much all of these motions are allowed with the ball and socket. Freely movable, allows us to move our bodies. However, what is it giving up? So think about that. What is it giving up? And then we have the specific, so we basically have covered all the material. Down at the bottom here on the bottom of page 3, it says the movements of synovial joints. And so it has gliding, flexion, extension, abduction and adduction, circumduction, rotation, and then medial rotation means to rotate towards the midline. Lateral rotation means to rotate away from the midline. What you want to know for those is which joints do that, right? Which joints do that motion? And that'll help us as we move towards muscles. And so the rest of these are joints for lab. So we'll be asked about these in lab, not in lecture. So they're not in your lecture packet. But your jaw joint is actually a really complicated joint. Believe it or not, it's complicated. So that's your temporal bone, mandibular, mandible. So you're just naming those joints. TMJ, people have a lot of problems with this joint, which allows for elevation and depression. Protraction is to bring it out. a retraction. Those are the movements that are allowed by this joint. But it's kind of a complex joint, and it's both hinge and condylar. So what I tend to do is just in lab, you want to know the anatomy we have to know for lab. And that's kind of it. Another joint is your glenohumeral, or you can call it humerus to scapula. That's fine. Joint. It is a ball and socket. There are several ligaments and tendons. I don't know which ones we need to know. There's 4 main muscles that are supported by this joint. It's a very weak joint, by the way. It's very easy to dislocate and pull that bone out of that socket. Very easy. Don't pick up little kids and swing them around by their arms because you can dislocate that joint. So the hip joint is a lot better. So when I just said hip, didn't I? So the femur to pubis bone is much better joint to be picking somebody up by. Yeah. Okay, so I don't know what we need to know for lab, but yes, it has bursa in it. It has it's synovial. It's a ball and socket. So we'll see when we get to lab. The other one could be the tibio, so tibia to femur, tibiofemoral, but you can just call it tibia to femur, right? You can just name those bones because that's how they're named, which is great. I don't know which specific structures we're going to need to know. And we'll just name them in lab. Probably some of the ligaments, like the ACL, just because they rip a lot. ACL, PCL, and the collateral ligaments, probably. And we'll see. This is a tough joint. Why? Because it's just holding a lot of weight on it. It really isn't a great joint because it allows so much motion, but yet it has to be stable. Think about that. We're asking a lot of this little joint. Okay. And then disorders, I'll let you read this on your own. But it's really interesting, some of the things that we're doing. I wanted to show you bursitis, menisci. I'm sure you know somebody that has either a torn menisci or pain in their meniscus, tendonitis, arthritis. Oh my goodness. So many different types, gout, infectious arthritis. But we're really changing the face of joints and how we operate on joints by prosthetics. So I will leave it there and see you in class.